Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome on this early first day of summer, apparently. It's nice and cool in here. I'm glad that the HVAC systems and Kennedy School are working well. But it's a beautiful day, and I'm glad you took time out to come in and join us. And the same welcome to those folks who are joining us on the Zoom online. This is the sixth session of this spring's Colloquium series on education policy as part of the program on education policy and governance. My name is Jim Pizer. I'll be your host for the day. Prior to January of this year, I was Secretary of Education in Massachusetts for about 8 years. And now I'm an academic visitor here at the Kennedy School, and I'm working with Marty West, who's here today, as well as Paul Peterson to help with this series together. We've got one more session before the end of the semester, and that's on Thursday, April 27th with Dr. Tom Kane, who will be presenting his findings on the impact of the last 30 years of education reform, in particular around closing achievement gaps. So please check out the PEPG website for more information about that, and hopefully mark your calendars so that you can all join us for that important closing session. The title for today's session is Aspirational Federalism, a Policy Pathway for Building a 21st Century Infrastructure for Civic Learning. And we'll start off with a presentation by Harvard professor and for those of us in the room, who are here from Massachusetts, former Massachusetts gubernatorial candidate, Danielle Allen, based on her groundbreaking work with Educating for American Democracy, a diverse coalition that has produced a roadmap to excellence in history and civics, which we'll learn more about shortly. Given the ideologically charged controversies that are swirling around America's schools today, finding common ground with regard to civics is a daunting challenge indeed. And as we'll hear today from Professor Allen, she's been leading this nonpartisan attempt to provide educators with a practical framework to offer students an inquiry-based content, along with tools and resources that teachers will need to address what she, I think, diplomatically calls some rich dilemmas that they are likely to encounter along the way. This topic is particularly timely here in the Commonwealth because schools are beginning to fully implement the state's new curriculum standards in history and social science, which include a full-year 8th grade civics course, as well as a 2018 civics education law, which, among other things, requires middle school and high school students to engage in student-led civic engagement projects. So this is in part because of COVID. I think there's been a slow roll in terms of the development of these programs in schools, but certainly beginning in the fall, I think we're going to see a lot of activity within civics education here in Massachusetts. So this is happening right at the right time. Professor Allen will be followed by Robert Pondiscio, who's sitting here to my right, who will provide commentary, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'll talk a little bit more about how we'll manage that in a second. But Robert is a former public school teacher who taught in the Bronx, and in fact taught civics in the Bronx, and is a journalist, an author, and he's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He recently published a book on New York City's Success Academy charter schools entitled How the Other Half Learns, Equality, Excellence, and the Battle Over School Choice, which I highly recommend. And I assume you can get it on Amazon.com, and perhaps even an autographed copy if you brought yours today with you. After Professor Allen's presentation and Robert's commentary, and perhaps a response from Professor Allen herself, we should have ample time for questions and answers and discussion. So hopefully we'll have a rich dialogue following the presentations. I will give priority to folks in the room in terms of asking questions and making comments, but to the extent possible, we'll try to involve folks who are participating via Zoom as well. I do want everyone to know that this session is being recorded for posterity and will soon be posted on the PEPG website. So if you're not here, and of course, if you're not here, you aren't hearing my voice, you can see this anytime you want, but you can certainly rewatch it on the website, hopefully beginning next week. And with that, it's my privilege to turn the program over to Professor Allen.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Secretary Sandra, I still need to call you now. I really appreciate the warm welcome and the invitation to be here and share this body of work. And Robert, it's a pleasure to share this conversational space with you again. We've been in the civics journey together for a spell, so it's good. Let's see, there we are. Can we actually, though, I'm sorry, go to the top of if you don't mind, I'm gonna appreciate that. Sorry if I misled or caused confusion. I wanted to start by providing people context by introducing the roadmap, and then I will come to the theme for today, which is aspirational federalism and the policy framework that we have developed as a part of trying to find pathway through the very complicated politics of education to ensure secure support for civic education over time. As I begin to introduce the Educating for American Democracy roadmap, I always like to say that we have the possibly unique distinction of having been supported as a program and effort by both the Trump and the Biden administrations. So this speaks to the point that Jim was making about how hard we have worked to achieve a broad cross-ideological coalition in our work. We have navigated the polarization of the space, primarily, honestly, by keeping our heads down, by doing the work, by trying to come up with what we thought was a good, strong, successful framework that could have broad buy-in and not engaging in all the crossfire that was going on. And in doing that, we've worked to build coalitions along the way. So I'm glad to introduce this roadmap to you. And as I said, we'll get to the sort of aspirational federalism part that is the policy framework behind it. So let's see. It might be because it's a PDF, I might need to ask you to go from slide to slide. Yeah, sorry about that. So as I mentioned, we are a diverse network funded by both the NEH and the US Department of Education in both administrations. This list of organizations, Circle at Tufts, iCivics, Saturday O'Connor founded Civic Ed Provider, my Staff Center for Ethics here at Harvard, Arizona State University School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, and then Tufts College of Civic Life more broadly. We were the anchor institutions for this project. And already they're a bridge building coalition, but we ultimately brought in a network of 300 scholars and educators across the country working on this. Academics and universities, but also K-12 educators, people who ran social studies for their districts, policymakers, the whole gamut. We could go to the next slide. This is sort of a photo of those of us who were specifically leading the work. That's just extra. So what did we do? We released a roadmap in March 2021, which does focus on content, the thing that is supposed to be impossible to do in the civic education space. But our view was that the space lacked a serious engagement with the question of what should be taught, in addition to engagement with questions of how to teach. The roadmap is an inquiry-based roadmap, so it's got 7 content areas: civic participation, our changing landscape, sort of geography and demography, we the people, how this society became a single democratic people, so that sort of philosophical foundations of democracy in there, new government and constitution, that's political institutions, institutional and social transformation, that's the court, amendments and social movements and politics and so forth over time, the people in the world, the global context for the US experience, and then contemporary debates and possibilities, which brings us to all of our hard issues and controversial topics. But through all these thematic areas, the structure is questions. What are the questions that educators should be ensuring that learners have the chance to engage in? And it's structured across the full K-12 spectrum with questions organized for the K through 2 grade band, and then 3 through 5, 6 through 8, and then high school. So that whole structure. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that the point there, of course, it's not a national curriculum, it's not a mandate. It is expert advice built from civil society expertise. And that's a really important point. So although it's funded federally, it is by no means the product of a federal agency. And neither of the agencies that supported it are in any way disseminating it as a mandate or as a national framework. It is a civil society product, and it is civil society's responsibility to disseminate and spread it. We could go to the next slide, please. Why is this work so important now? You all know all the reasons it's so important. Our democracy is incredibly fragile, not only because of these big events that are seared into all of our memories, but polling just indicates an ever worsening situation. I used to share the fact that whereas for the generation before World War II, about 70% of that cohort consider it essential to live in a democracy. It's the case that for millennials, not quite 30% consider it essential to live in a democracy. And you can't have a democracy if people don't want a democracy. So there's a kind of basic educational mission to reverse course on that. But new data actually turns out to be even worse. So as of this January, about 73% of that baby boomer generation feel proud to live in America. For Gen Z, it's 16%. All right, so we have a huge amount of work to do to rebuild a sense of connection to our society, to our political institutions and the like. So that's the reason for this important work. Okay, we can go past this information, which is information you know. So up till very recently, our national priorities have not supported civic education. This data that we spent $50 per student per year on STEM education and 15 cents per student per year on civic education is current data as of this past congressional session, when the omnibus budget bill tripled the amount of investment in civic education. So prior to December, the number was $50 per year per kid on STEM education in federal dollars and 5 cents per year per kid on civic education. So we're going in the right direction. That's good news, but we have a long way to go. And this is a both and story. This is not about that we should do civics instead of STEM education. We clearly need STEM education, but we do need to invest seriously in civic education in the country. All right, if we could go to the next slide. So then what we've heard so far is a story of federal investment in producing a framework that civil society owns. So it's not a federal product. And I'm underscoring that because that will be an important part of the sort of picture of federalism that I then will paint fully in this. You've also heard me say there's another role for the federal government, which is about funding this work and effort. But what else needs to happen? The roadmap can be used by teachers, schools, districts, or states. Okay. So I said, right, the US Department of Ed is not pushing out the roadmap. The NEH is not pushing out the roadmap. So who uses it instead? Everybody else in the landscape. The roadmap can be used by individual teachers in social studies or ELA or other disciplines to consider the question of where might they take questions from the roadmap and fold them into the curricular work they're doing in whichever discipline they're responsible for. School leaders, district leaders can use the roadmap to guide planning processes for their schools and districts about how they might increase an orientation towards civic learning. That has to be to some extent by multi-purpose action, by multitasking, by making sure that ELA is engaging with civics questions, that science is engaging with civics questions and the like, because otherwise there's not enough time in the school day to achieve a real increase in civic learning. So we need all practitioners to participate. The roadmap can also be used by state standard setters to revisit their state standards. If we could wave a magic wand and achieve a dream, it would be that standards would be reorganized around an inquiry structure as opposed to lists of pieces of information that students should acquire. That is a very big dream, but nonetheless, the question of what thematic areas get covered in standards is one that we are starting to see some shifts already in light of reference to the roadmap. I shared the 7 themes already, so we can keep going, but let me just give you an example then of how the themes work. So under the theme 3, we the people, broadly, this theme explores the idea of the people as a political concept. So not just a group of people who share a physical landscape, but also a group of people who share political ideals and institutions, all right? And to pursue that theme requires both history and civics. And you can think of civics as being a space occupied by the disciplines of political science in a university and philosophy, and specifically sort of philosophical foundations of democracy. I'm saying that out loud because when we started this work, it was really the case that many of the educators we worked with in the K-12 space really had no visibility into the discipline of political science. Even a major school district leader who was responsible for social studies literally at an early meeting said, "What's political science?" So that's how much work there is to sort of rebuild understanding of the subject matter that's pertinent to civic education. So the roadmap is structured with both history and civics thematic questions. Who are we as the people of the United States and how has the nation's population changed over time as a historical question? Why does constitutional democracy depend on the idea of the people as a political science and philosophy question? Or what does our history reveal about the aspirations and tensions captured by the motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one? And what values, virtues, and principles can knit together we the people of the United States of America? So I hope you can see the linkages between historical questions, how have people approached this, and the political science and philosophical questions, how should we approach this? All right, go to the next slide. So this then sort of indicates the kind of transition we're trying to affect in the landscape from, current state standards, which list historical events, for example, French and Indian War, Stamp Act, Boston Tea Party, to a theme with a set of questions. What were the experiences with the British government of British colonists, Indigenous Americans, enslaved Americans, and indentured Americans? When you listen to that question, you'll also hear another thing we're doing in the roadmap, which is really offering questions that require weaving together the stories of many different categories of Americans with different historical experiences in their own family lineage. And that's a theme throughout the roadmap. We are constantly seeking to formulate questions that work towards a weaving together of diverse and distinct narratives that exist in the American experience. We can go to the next slide. In addition to the inquiry content themes, what we also did was identify design challenges that we think are at the core of successful civic education practice. So a design challenge is a dilemma, a hard problem to solve for which there is no upfront straightforward answer to what the solution is, and where what we need to do is activate the nation's community of educators and professionals to offer solutions to the design challenges, and then in a community of practice to explore which are the solutions that work the best. So for example, the first design challenge is, it can be the case that when you seek to educate students about the broad structures of the country and political facts, they can experience a sort of disablement. They don't feel their own agency in relationship to the big structures and the big institutions. So a design challenge is how to provide that broad-based education, looking at the whole picture of the country, while also motivating student agency, keeping those two pieces together. Or the fourth one, which is probably our favorite one, the design challenge of how you tell the both good and the bad of the American experience, how you cultivate patriotism that goes alongside reflectiveness, the ability to be clear-eyed about shortcomings of the country as well as virtues. And again, so many people are sort of experimenting with trying to find solutions to these design challenges. We could go on to the next one. We can move past that as well. Then lastly, the third part of the roadmap is a set of pedagogical principles. Because it's an inquiry-based framework, that's the first principle. So you might imagine that we're starting with inquiry-based instruction. If we go to the next slide, you can see that in addition to that inquiry as primary mode of learning, number 4, we're focused on excellence for all. So that's that high standard of achievement for all learners, regardless of background and where they're starting from. It's familiar from existing stories. Growth mindset and capacity building for educators as well as for students. The notion that the job is to build EAD-ready classrooms and schools, so really empowering local leaders, teachers and district leaders to take the roadmap and use it to think about their school and classroom design. We are under principle 5, we are not working just so that people become holders of information. We are seeking to empower students as citizens, as participants in our community. So there is a principle of practicing constitutional democracy and supporting student agency that relates to that 2018 law that you described. And then building communities of continuous learning is sort of the 6th principle there. All right, so now I can head in the direction of the policy framework that is, we hope will help bring all of this into reality. Our ambitious goals are that we would have 60 million students. That's basically all students, as you know. So, but who you don't want to leave anybody out of learning of this kind, right? So that's got to be the goal, which we think means 100,000 schools that we would designate as civic ready. And we have a sort of view about what that entails. We have a civic learning plan in place and resources to support it. And then that means also 1 million teachers who would be EAD ready, having received excellent pre and in-service professional development in this space specifically. All right, those are huge goals. We have sort of 10-year time horizon on that. But now how to achieve them via aspirational federalism. All right, so as we did our work on this roadmap, we really wrestled with some of the hard questions about federalism. And as you know, they're sort of putting it very crudely, 2 existing core models of federalism. Federalism is states' rights, where states sort of get to do whatever they want. That has been a conception in popular discourse that is prominent on the right. So it's not, I'm not giving you the sophisticated versions of these ideas. I'm giving you the sort of popular understandings. And on the left, forceful federalism, which on this conception, federalism entails the direct intervention of a robust and effective national government, typically in order to ensure rights guarantees to protected populations. So this is the picture of federalism that comes out of the era of the civil rights movement, the need to enforce school desegregation, for example, and the idea that the federal government would have a policy paradigm that it's its job to push all the way down. And I mean, I don't have to tell you, you all know how much the questions of federalism have been at the source of tension and controversy in the educational landscape. Of course, the sort of Obama Race to the Top program was an effort to use a different model, something similar to aspirational federalism in a sense. And on the aspirational federalism model, the goal is to be really clear about which each jurisdictional level, what responsibilities each jurisdictional level in the country should have for any given policy paradigm, to try to harmonize goals across those jurisdictional levels, and then to ensure that each jurisdictional component is contributing to that broad purpose. I think the difference between the sort of race to the top model and the model that we have ended up developing is the competitive element in the race to the top model. So we're not building a competition. What we've been trying to do is develop national standards, again, articulated in civil society, not by the government. Okay, that's sort of point number one. That's the first rule. National civil society has a role to play in this model of aspirational federalism. Then to get very clear on who bears implementation responsibility, and we see that as states, LEAs, educators. All right, and so all of the question of, well, what does this framework actually look like inside a school, we believe has to be answered in context-specific ways. The answers will look different across different states, but by the same time, you want to be able to evaluate performance and make comparisons across states. That requires data and evaluation, so that comes back then to a function actually for the federal government, that we do need the federal government to be an anchor for data systems that are consistent across context. And then the last piece is funding for the entire structure. And that is a place where there continues to be great disagreement, even within the community that worked on this roadmap, with a portion of the community thinking that federal funds are necessary for this, so that then the federal role has two parts to it, the data part and the funding part. And then there are folks who think that the relevant funding should be entirely at the state level. So the result is that we're working on both fronts, as you might imagine, pursuing both state level policy change to introduce requirements quite like Massachusetts' requirements. So more time mandated on social studies or civics in schools, and then state budgets following to support that. We have also been advocating for something called the Civic Secures Democracy Act. And the Civic Secures Democracy Act would direct funds to states to then figure out within the state how to allocate. The Civic Secures Democracy Act is not directly tethered to the Educating for American Democracy roadmap. So this gets to that interesting relationship between the federal government and civil society. The point is that the federal act has nothing in it about content at all. It is an enabling structure. Funds provision, willingness to build out data capacity at the federal level, and that's it. Some of those funds are also about funds to civil society to provide resources in support of civic education. So then how does that all come together? It comes together in the sense that in the civil society space, we have been building a big consortium of organizations that are aligned in a similar direction, stand ready to do work with districts and states the moment that districts and states are ready to do that work and are bringing either state funding or federal funding to bear in order to achieve that. So if we go to the next slide, to one more. I mean, this is a visualization that just gives you a bit of a sense, and I'll go through each level again really fast, but we're trying to get all the gears to turn in relationship to each other without top-down directives from the federal government. So on the next slide, that makes the local the most important level in a certain sense. And so that's where, you know, the goal is to drive a movement for the establishment of civic learning plans at the LEA level. We are building out capacity to support implementation. When I say we, I mean the organizations that deliver the EAD roadmap. We're building out capacity to support implementation so that we can give people support as they seek to build out civic learning plans. Those plans include not just the question of what professional development is necessary, but also student progress measures. We have other aspirations that we would be working to see in those civic learning plans, including commitments to equity, for example, and real world civic and community engagement opportunities. We could go to the next level. At the state level, as I said, this is where we are working to ensure that standards incorporate EAD guidance. We see the standard setting as critical there, advocating that states prioritize innovation and recognition of history and civics excellence, do standard setting work, and activate the higher ed institutions in their states in support of this work. That's an important sort of piece of the model for how we think states can be contributing here. And then if we go to the next slide. So again, on the national level, right, just this is sort of in some sense the most important point. What we're really saying is that there's got to be this partnership between civil society and the federal government. And what we mean by this partnership is to really emphasize the value of the professional knowledge and expertise that exists in civil society. And that is independent, independent, literally speaking independent from the federal government, and therefore cannot be co-opted in any kind of way as a sort of propaganda engine for a government that was sort of trying to generate substantive content for schools. So to see the national civil society as important a part of the policy landscape as the federal government is one of the important ideas that we came to as a group that helped us conceptualize the policy model here. And so then again, that leaves the federal government with the role specifically of working on data that can support harmonizing the work across the states and prioritizing civic learning and research and innovation through investment. So those last two bullets refer to federal funding. But again, in that fashion where there's very serious trust and empowerment of states rather than a directive structure in relationship to states. So I hope that gave a picture of what, the sort of approach to federalism that we developed as a part of doing this work. Really eager to hear Robert's thoughts about it, and then looking forward to the conversation.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Allen. Thank you, Jim, for inviting me. Let me just offer a couple of quick background notes just to orient you from my perspective. So as Jim mentioned, I was a South Bronx public school fifth grade teacher for several years. I didn't teach civics in the Bronx. I taught it later in my career with Democracy Prep in Harlem, New York, a charter school that is devoted to civic education. So I taught a seminar class there for several years. I worked in ed policy at the Fordham Institute and now at AEI. But honestly, I think of myself more of as a practice or practitioner than a policy person. I tend to focus on curriculum, instruction, school culture, and whatnot. I have some experience with aspirational federalism, and I put it in the bucket of things that I choose to love. And what I mean by that is, and in particular with the roadmap, I support it. I want it to succeed, but I am congenitally skeptical of efforts to change practice, classroom practice, from afar, whether it's the national level, the state level, or frankly, even at the district level. Apropos of building civic knowledge, for example, I'm an unapologetic disciple of E.D. Hirsch's core knowledge work, which would benefit from aspirational federalism. Let's be clear. I supported Common Core because it was a potential delivery mechanism for many of these things that I value. A subject for another day, Professor Allen. You noted that it's not a curriculum, which is the roadmap is not a curriculum. That's a mixed blessing, I would argue. In other words, I would argue teachers would probably benefit from a robust, structured curriculum, but the culture of teaching and education generally frowns upon that. So it's as I said, a subject for another day. Look, we can't not be mindful of the hostility that greeted Common Core state standards. That hints at the suspicion and skepticism with which efforts to harmonize standards and assessments, to use your phrase, are received. I think that's just a reality, an on-the-ground reality we have to be mindful of. So where does this lead? I'm broadly supportive of the roadmap. many people that I admire, both personally and professionally, none not the least of which is Dr. Allen, contributed to it. But I have concerns not about the roadmap itself, but the theory of change and frankly, the conditions in American schools and American education at large at this present moment, which would make this an extraordinarily heavy lift. And let me say more about that. My first major concern is that we have a long way to go to convince American education to take up this challenge at all. The challenge of preparing America's children for active and engaged citizenship. You breezed by a slide on NAEP, but as we probably all know, NAEP scores in civics, history, and geography make NAEP reading look robust, and we're used to describing NAEP reading as a crisis. From time to time, I enjoy looking at the mission and vision statements of the largest public school districts and their core values based on public pronouncements. These statements, and they have not changed a lot in time, demonstrate shockingly little concern for the public role of citizen making. There was just another study just last week from Pew, which showed that 80% of, I've tended to look at the largest districts, Pew looked at all of them, I believe, and 80% of these statements talk about preparing students for their futures. There's some red-blue divides between whether they valorize DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion ideals. That's more prevalent in red districts and blue districts, or the opposite, forgive me. Bottom line is the private concerns for preparation for college and career dominate these mission statements. And let's be clear, no teacher takes down their district's mission statement when deciding what to teach, but it's instructive. It tells us what the men and women who are overseeing our school districts are thinking about when they challenge themselves to say, okay, what's our role here? What do we do? This just does not come up. Where citizenship is mentioned, it tends to be more often than not in the context of global citizenship, for example. The most shocking thing, that, at least to me, that I found in the mission and vision statements that I reviewed, the word patriotism literally appears not one time in any of them, not even once. Neither does the word America or American. This is a stunning departure from the historical role of public education, from its founding ideals. E.D. Hirsch Jr., who I alluded to a moment ago, in his book, Making of Americans, took note of what he described as the anxious theme that ran through the writings of our earliest theorists of education, men like Noah Webster and Benjamin Rush, even Washington and Jefferson, who viewed the citizen-making role of public education as the reason. Cultivating patriotism, they believe, was essential to the survival of the Republic. So let me fast forward to the present moment. Coming out of COVID, the relationship between Americans and public schools, I've observed, has just never seen more at play than it is at the present moment. I will leave it to all of us to decide whether or not that represents a threat or an opportunity for this work. For those of us who see education as an indispensable mechanism for building students' knowledge and capacities to sustain American democracy. But let me throw some on-the-ground figures at you that should sober us. My AEI colleague, Nat Malkus, has documented that public school districts coming out of the pandemic have lost 1.2 million students from that 60 million that you alluded to. Measures of trust in public education and teachers, while still comparatively strong, are softening. I think we all know this, right? For decades, Americans have given low marks to public education at large, but high marks to my child's school, my child's teacher. That's still basically true, but those lines are starting to converge. Same thing with, for decades, data or polling has shown that school teachers are among the most trusted professions in America. Comparatively, that's still true. In real numbers, that's declining as well. The threat that nobody's talking about, and I shouldn't call it a threat because I don't think it is, but about a dozen states now offer educational savings accounts. 6 of them have universal ESAs. Arizona, West Virginia, Iowa, Arkansas, Utah, and Florida. This enables parents to quite literally opt out of the public education system and take with them the lion's share of state dollars to purchase education services from simply paying private schools tuition to more bespoke options. Now, as a charter school and choice proponent, and someone who was broadly deferential to parents' rights to direct their children's education. I'm fine with this. I'm all for it. But as an American and as a patriot, it concerns me that a bedrock institution of American life, that trust in that institution has softened to the point where there's political momentum to just exit the system and go it alone. And no one likes to hear this, but Jay Green and Jason Bedrick of the Heritage Foundation have argued recently quite persuasively that after generations of arguments for school choice on the grounds of school performance and competition, what's now driving a lot of this desire to exit, is what we would call or consider culture war imperatives. You know, the sense that public education is pursuing its own agenda, not that of parents, not that of the common good. And evidence suggests it's not pursuing, as I alluded a moment ago, to the purpose of citizen making either. The ESA movement started with small states, as you may know, then Florida doubled the number in one fell swoop. And if Texas adopts ESAs, which is a real possibility, it will double again. And that would mean that roughly 1 in 4 American families would have this power of the purse to just exit the system altogether. This is an unusually, I think, potent threat to the dominant paradigm of American education and a cultural habit that has persisted for generations. This idea of sending our children, for good or for ill, to a nearby district-run school. So the 10-year time horizon to which Dr. Allen referred to, things may look very, very different in 10 years from now. They're already looking different today. So in conclusion, I don't think it's overstating the case to say that a significant number of Americans, and by the way, if I haven't been clear, this work matters. It should matter to all of us, but it needs to reside somewhere. It needs champions. And I'm not sure that at present that the appetite exists on the ground I'm not seeing who those champions are. I'm not seeing where they're coming from. So I don't think I'm overstating the case to say that as for a significant number of Americans, whether they would consciously frame it this way or not, are beginning to question the very legitimacy of public education, pushing back hard against its permission structures. So all of this colors my view of aspirational federalism. At the outset, I noted my skepticism. The forces that I've described, a public education system that doesn't seem to embrace or much want to embrace its role in citizen making, parents and politicians who are disenchanted with public education, and the loss of public schools. As much as I want to be optimistic about this work and as much as I support it, it makes me more pessimistic than I would like to be.
Thank you, Robert. You could just take your seats up here. Professor Allen, if you'd like to make some response, and then we'll open up for questions.
Thank you so much. Really thoughtful comments. I appreciate your supportive words for the roadmap itself. Thank you. So I think I want to respond on 2 points: the point about curriculum, which is really important, and then the point about the shifting structure of public education broadly and what that means for this endeavor. So on the curriculum point, I agree with you. And I think one of our weaknesses right now in the educational system is the fact that so many teachers are just trying to come together from the internet rather than working with high quality curricula. And I think actually we broadly agree about that in the EAD movement. What the framework is supporting is a network of providers who are developing curriculum that are aligned with it. So we have one here in Massachusetts, actually, Jim, which we've been iterating on for 4 years at this point, and we'll do a full release for the state this summer for the full year-long grade 8 curriculum that's aligned with roadmap. And we're not alone. So there are now 9 different pilots in 9 different states, sort of working in this fashion. And I think one of the things the roadmap has facilitated actually is much more productive collaborations between universities and education providers and districts. And I think that those are the collaborations we actually need to get back to a place where we're creating high quality curriculum for K-12 schools. My own view is that universities in the humanities and social sciences have abdicated their responsibilities in relationship to K-12. So we see much stronger collaborations between sciences in the higher ed space and K-12 curriculum development. For me, that's really one of the single greatest weaknesses we have. And this roadmap supports closing that gap or filling that gap. So then with regard to the broad structure of public education, I agree with you. I mean, I think this is a concerning phenomenon for the reasons that you articulated. I am a generally ecumenical person. I served on the governing board for the University of Chicago charter school system. So in that regard, over my career, I have supported a variety of different kinds of schools. But when I served in Chicago, it mattered to me that the Chicago structure was one in which charters were inside the public system. And that there was a sort of way that even that innovation was reinforcing the public structure. And so it is a concern to watch the erosion of a commitment to public schooling. When you look back at the sort of early history, of course, of it, it's towns committed to civic education for their young people. I mean, here in Massachusetts, the basic original purpose of schools in the 1600s, so really early, was that people learn the recently published laws of the colony. It was sort of that direct and specific. And it matters that we form a community across context through our schools. So I don't think I have a good answer to you for, how should we adjust our frame given that? We do seek to disseminate the roadmap to private schools as well as to public schools. We don't think of it as a tool exclusively for public schools. Nonetheless, your deeper point about the infrastructure of schooling in the US, I don't have a good sort of way of thinking about yet. So I look forward to the conversation. I hope others have guidance and suggestions.
If I can ask a question though, and maybe I kind of didn't hit this point, I wasn't clear enough on it. Am I wrong to suggest that our conception of what school is for, what education is for, has evolved? So in other words, it's almost a revival movement in a sense, right? We have to sell people on the idea, and I hate to frame it in terms of sales, that sounds insubstantial, but we have to convince Americans that there is a public dimension to education, regardless of under whose roof it occurs, that we cannot neglect. And that is a generational change. Right? So what
gives me any hope
reassure me that we have a plan for that?
Right. Well, so yes, it is a revival. It is an effort to call people back to that commitment. The Educating for American Democracy movement, as we now like to say about ourselves, is also aimed at giving people tools that give them confidence that they can participate in this way and feel good about it. So you spoke about the way in which the culture wars are eroding families' sort of sense of trust in or connection to schooling. The roadmap is meant to be, in part, a solution to that problem. One of the things that we're doing now is supporting more work, helping schools think about parental and family engagement. That is a piece of education that has always been fundamental. So it's not just a matter of there being a kind of new political movement around parents' rights. I mean, any person in education knows that that connection with the family or the caretakers is at the base of a healthy educational relationship. And so across the spectrum, people have put work into that. We're trying to support work on that front that is specifically about helping parents come to experience buy-in for the Educating for American Democracy approach to civic education. And again, because it's inquiry-based, it's not about, here's the answer, here's the position you have to take. The questions we're all fighting about in this country, we're fighting about them for a reason, because there are lots of hard questions in there. And so the thing we have to do is equip adults and students with the capacity to have productive conversations about those hard things. And so that's one of the key missions of education underneath this framework. Will we get to the place you're pointing to, the need to reanimate that connection to the public mission of schooling? We intend to. It's early days, so I can't at the moment give you a prognosis,
So before I open up to everyone, maybe I'll start with a question. You can all start thinking. You might want to interact with our guests. But one question I have and one concern is that, first of all, one of the things that I like so much about the roadmap is how kind of comprehensive and balanced it is, not from a left-right perspective, but in terms of all the various skills, knowledge areas, the inquiry context for it. It's a well-rounded educational experience if done well. The thing I worry a little bit about is there's been a lot of attention paid recently, including here in Massachusetts, towards participatory civics or civic engagement. Which seems, at least in some cases, and maybe even many, to sort of privilege advocacy over deliberation, and real, I would say, engagement with, peers and, and other citizens, which sort of sounds like in some ways we may be launching a bunch of unguided missiles that are going to create more controversy or more anxiety about civics education than we started with. I wonder if you could just comment on that, and both of you certainly, but Danielle in particular, how you think about this sort of fitting well within the construct of the roadmap, so that it is more of a not only a learning experience, but a positive reinforcement of civics education.
Absolutely. I think this is a core issue, and the Edmund and Lilly Stafford Center for Ethics, which I direct, hosted a big national conference on civic education on this campus in June of 2018. That conference was in some sense the origin for this whole body of work. And the single biggest theme that came out of that conference was exactly what you just named, a sort of real split in the field between people who were oriented towards action civics, in this rather the kind of conventional label, and folks who cared about content, subject matter expertise, and the like. And the basic mission that many of us took out of that conference was to break down that sense of opposition between those two things, and to make sure that support for student agency and civic engagement was fully integrated with a strong knowledge-based foundation. So I would say that that sort of integration of knowledge with the experiential is really at the heart of the effort of the roadmap. And so when you look at those themes, the first one is civic participation. That is about, why does it matter to be an active citizen? And then the seventh one comes back to engagement, sort of contemporary people with contemporary debates and possibilities. But 2 through 6 are all kind of core content themes. And we are currently doing the work of developing rubrics for grant applications that give people funding to pilot things, and asking the question of how do we make sure that in any given pilot, people are linking, if they're using theme 1 or 7, that they're linking it to material from themes 2 through 6 as well. So I think we're working out in process how to achieve that union of a focus on core content and understanding and thoughtfulness and the like, with that scaffolding of student engagement. But that's the thing we're aimed at achieving.
I'll add on by just noting inquiry-based education is devilishly difficult to implement well. And I've already acknowledged that I'm a unapologetic content guy. So that in theory, inquiry-based education creates the conditions in which a student becomes curious and needs to undergird, to get done what they want to get done. They need to take direction or take their self-direct, learn the content, as it were. It springs from a progressive education tradition. My other issue, Jim, and I don't want to say it's an issue because we want our kids to be, engaged, active citizens. We want them to learn where the levers are and how to pull them. That's absolutely a valid part of a civic education. My concern about action civics, to use the term of art, is that it privileges the bad and the broken in American life. In other words, to the degree to which your civic education is dominated by problem solving, it could unwittingly send the signal that American life is nothing but a collection of problems. In other words, where there has to be room in a civic education for optimism. As one friend of mine says, you have to love something before you want to change it. So this cannot get lost. In other words, you have to create the conditions not only in which children are challenged to solve problems, but are motivated to solve problems because they care about the outcome. Questions?
So this is fascinating. I'll ask a question about assessment, which I think was the 6th element in your pedagogical framework for the effort. I'm just curious to hear more about how you see it fitting into the implementation of the aspirational federalism vision. We do have a national assessment in the NAEP that you referred briefly to. I'm wondering if that existing assessment is close enough to the framework that it could serve as a progress metric. Of course, right now, that assessment is only administered nationally and not state by state, though the National Assessment Governing Board, on which I sit, would be very interested in a state level NAEP assessment where we'd have the budget to do it and less of an obligation to use our budget on constant reading and math assessment. So that's one question, just what role do you see for NAEP in this? But beyond that, do you also see a role for, I don't know, universal assessment at the state level, with states developing their own tests? I suspect that that's one reason why the fact that we don't have state tests in civics and history very often is one reason why we've seen a decline in the instructional time allocated to those subjects. I think we have pretty good evidence of that. In fact, here in Massachusetts, I think we actually have a legislative mandate to develop a civics test that we've never acted on because other things become the priority in practice. So it's not a very coherent question except for the part about NAEP, but can you talk a little bit about assessment?
No, it's a hugely important part of it all. So maybe first, let me sort of report out on what we have done to date and then what we hope to do. So the Civic Secures Democracy Act that I mentioned there have been a couple of different versions of it now. It's been introduced in 2 sessions, so I may not have exactly right the most current formulation, but my memory of it is, it supported increasing the frequency with which the NAEP exam is administered. It also included some provisions for taking the time to review how the NAEP is structured to see if there is room for improvement in it. So I think the sort of position has been, we'd be glad to use NAEP and see it administered more often. We'd also like, if the chance makes itself available, to do some work to improve it. And then, yes, state assessment is an important.
Just very, NAEP would be really important to do it both more frequently, but also at the state level, because
Right.
these national data are really hard to, you get an abstract number for the nation and.
Which we would endorse. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, we would endorse that. And in support of both, a potentially iterated NAEP exam and state level assessments, we are doing assessment work ourselves too. By ourselves, what I mean is the consortium of organizations that developed the roadmap continue to exist now as what we call EDIC, so it's a terrible acronym, Educating for American Democracy Implementation Consortium. Okay. So EDIC, one of the things we're working on is building out a sort of infrastructure for research and evaluation. And we do have a sort of shared categories of assessment framework now, civic readiness wheel, as we call it, a nice sort of wheel shape and it touches knowledge, skills, dispositions, and engagement opportunities. And we're currently working on sort of building out research briefs that give more clarity to what we already know how to measure amongst all those things. A lot of it we do already know how to measure, just hasn't been organized effectively. And then individual organizations within this movement are starting to build out and use assessment tools. So our curriculum will be rolled out in Massachusetts with a full battery of assessment things, both formative and summative components. The state has made progress on the state civics test. So I think they're expecting to actually administer it next year, probably something like that. My daughter is expecting it. I can tell you that. She's in 7th grade and she's expecting to have to take it next year. So anyway, so the short of it is, yes, we are fully in support of the notion that we need meaningful accountability and accountability that supports cross-context comparability. We think we can build on some of the existing tools and also work to improve them.
Can I just follow up? And EDIC, I'm not coercive, but EDIC, I love the acronym.
Yeah, doesn't sound good, though.
I understand that you are not wonderfully reluctant to impose your vision on states. But let's say a state came to you and said, Dr. Allen, how do we structure the accountability? In other words, it's one thing to, even if we had a state level NAEP data, then what is it the power of embarrassment that inspires one school to adopt this? Because New Hampshire wants to beat Vermont, for example. So what would the accountability look like, or what could it look like? In other words, how to reiterate my previous point, how do you convince American education not only that they should do this as a moral imperative, but we're going to, quote, hold them accountable for doing it?
Yes. So there are two answers to that on the table right now. So there's the thing that we're pursuing currently in the current environment, and then the thing that we would like to do. The thing that we would like to do is the state level testing that is in support. Or I say testing, and there's also a lot of room for innovation in the assessment field right now. So state level assessment, let's put it that way. So portfolios and so forth are relevant too, not just testing. But in the current context, what we have been advocating for with states at the policy level is the use of seals of excellence for civic learning that would bring rewards to schools that earn these. So focused on that assessment and accountability at the school level rather than at the individual learner level at the moment. And using that sort of civic seal concept. And there are a couple of states that are starting to explore this kind of methodology.
And there'd be monetary rewards. associated with
Exactly,
this.
yeah.
Questions?
So carrots rather than
Not
sticks.
sticks, right.
And thank you for laying out the caramel shields. I'm an ALI.
See you.
Thanks. So it's the benchmark of 10 years that I'm agree it's realistic. It makes me nervous. I think it'd be great to accelerate it. But my question really is about consensus. Is there a consensus or is it a point of inquiry about the definition of patriotism?
So our roadmap achieved a consensus under the framework of reflective patriotism. And we spent a long time talking about that. So when I say achieved a consensus, like I really literally mean achieved a consensus. And it is not, I mean, so let me just say a bit about our working method. So from the very beginning, we established a group of people that were ideologically diverse. And we started with the kind of commitment that we all thought the civic learning situation was a crisis, and that we were all in agreement, despite being in different positions on the ideological map, about the need to address it. And we were going to kind of commit to each other and commit to this project, even though we knew we were going to hit disagreements. And we also committed that when we hit disagreements, we would stop and argue about them until we found compromises. And the need to do that started right at the very, very beginning. So within 2 weeks of working, I don't know if you've heard me tell this story. Within 2 weeks of working, we got into a big argument about whether or not we were educating for a democracy or for a republic. And we spent weeks literally arguing about this. And we came to the conclusion that there were some good points on both sides. That on the Republic side, you know, the reason to support that idea was a commitment to constitutionalism, order, structure, things like that. And on the democracy side, the reason to support that idea was commitments to popular sovereignty and participation and inclusion and so forth. So our compromise was that we decided we were educating for constitutional democracy. And so if you read the roadmap, you'll see the phrase constitutional democracy all over it. Sometimes you'll see a one-off democracy or one-off republic as well, but constitutional democracy is the center for gravity in terms of what we are educating for. So the same thing happened when we came to talk about patriotism, sort of lots and lots of rounds of debate and argument. And the phrase reflective patriotism became the thing that we collectively landed on, because what it did was convey both the need to commit to something, that love of country is a valuable thing, and we want to foster love of country, but we don't want a blind love of country. We don't want to not see all the failings and sins of both omission and commission that both characterize our history and are also part of our present. So the reflective part was really capturing that idea that we're supporting critical thinking, honesty, clear-eyed evaluations of what's working, what's not working in our contemporary situation. So reflective patriotism was a hard one, concept that is at the center of the roadmap.
Both of you. I come from the performing arts, nonprofit performing arts. And you mentioned, Professor Allen, that perhaps the humanities and higher ed has abdicated its responsibility to K through 12. So given that your aspirations for this are society driven, is there a place for other elements of that to engage with this? So is there a place for the MFA in this? Is there a place for the Massachusetts Historical Society in this? I recognizing it's probably the margins and probably recognizing that it might perhaps cloud the assessment process. But do you see a place for these types of organizations being involved in this beyond the 100,000 schools?
Yes, absolutely. And we can sign you up right now if you'd like to participate. I've got a pledge card right here. So yes, we actually have a cultural institutions working group that is asking exactly the question of how museums can contribute. So for all the educational programs museums already do, can they integrate the roadmap into that work? Where can they use their programming to support this? So that's one place where there's absolutely a role to play. We're also currently, I mentioned this, we have a grant application process right now for people to develop K-5 pilots. That's sort of where the fewest resources currently exist. And that is includes the opportunity for cultural organizations to partner with schools to develop something. So the subject matter expertise that exists in cultural institutions could absolutely also be brought to bear in this space from our point of view. So we are, again, this is, we're doing our own kind of project-based learning sort of process where we're sort of learning as we go, trying to find the most effective pathways to connecting the people with subject matter expertise with the educators, giving support for full curriculum development so that the teacher can really have a thing that's excellent from start to finish and not be at like 10 p.m. at night, pulling things off the internet. Yeah, thank you.
One question. As Robert mentioned, inquiry-based instruction is very difficult. Teaching itself is very difficult, right? So, and this is obviously new in a lot of ways, and rich in content, but there's a lot of it as well. Yeah. How do you think about the kind of training for teachers, both pre-service and in service, which in some ways gets back to their higher ed point, but also how do you think about, I don't know, sort of both awareness and training for school leaders and district leaders? Because, on the one hand, and a lot of reform efforts have happened sort of class by class, teacher by teacher, there's a way to do some sort of a bottom up approach to it. But presumably to get to scale and to do things a little bit more systematically, you need to have school and district leadership involved, bought in, et cetera. How do you sort of think about that very pragmatic implementation challenge?
Oh, I would love to come pick your brains about that. In fact, so watch out. I'm going to be reaching out for an appointment. On this subject.
Get signed up.
That's right. Exactly. Yes. There we go. Good. No. So we are working on that right now. Now, when I say we in this instance, I do mean the whole EDIC consortium, but I also mean specifically the Stafford Center for Ethics here. Stafford Center, as a part of our curricular work in Massachusetts, has also been doing work on professional development around the curriculum we've been developing. And we are just literally, like, I just sent a document off, 20 minutes ago, trying to design a program that would be, more broadly kind of comprehensive for the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap. It could be offered nationally through the Harvard Graduate School of Education with virtual courses. We'd only be a part of the puzzle, and so, it's a mixture of offerings that are about instructional strategy for civic learning and all of the specifics of that. I mean, there are very specific problems that emerge in the civic learning context. You alluded to some of them around an informed advocacy problem or the polarization and those kinds of issues. And we've done a lot of research work over recent years about how learners develop a civic identity, a sense of a civic role they want to claim and connect that to other parts of their identity. So we have been doing professional development in that space, but then also the sort of PD that's connected to the core content, where educators really do need to rebuild some muscles around, American political institutions, founding documents and the like. And then a set of offerings that are around the implementation question. And as we are working to design this, some of them we're designing for frontline educators, but some of them we really are thinking about district leaders and trying to figure out how to reach a kind of national audience of district leaders to bring them in to think about implementation, but also give them some sort of direct exposure to the pedagogic methods and the content so that they have a rich understanding of what it is that then they might be seeking to implement. So anybody who wants to sign up to help provide advice on this, I'd be delighted to take names and numbers. So
I think that the extent can create some exemplars at a school and district level. I think there's a trade-off between focusing on creating those exemplars and providing resources and tools broadly, which may lead to no matter how good the tools and resources are, may lead to kind of mediocre or worse implementation, which then could sour people on the whole thing. And obviously there are trade-offs with either one, but I guess my question is, are you thinking about kind of going deep with a few leading adopters and trying to just have really excellent implementation? Or is it really more broad-based availability of resources and materials? And I'm phrasing this in a pejorative way, right? And hoping for the best.
So I think what we're trying to do across our network of organizations is both and by drawing on the different skills of the different member organizations in EDIC. So I mentioned sort of 9 pilot programs in 9 states. Those are the deep version, deep implementation. And so we are doing that work here in Massachusetts. And at the Stafford Center, our focus has just always been on Massachusetts. People have asked us to do stuff in other states. No, we're doing Massachusetts. We're only going to do Massachusetts. We're going to get better and better and better at doing Massachusetts. And then if we think we have something that's like really, really good, then you could come learn from it and copy it. But we're going to keep focused on Massachusetts. So that sort of is the kind of attitude for all of the sort of 9 pilot programs. But we are, I mean, to Robert's point, the question of how do you rebuild the interest and commitment, we do know that we need to build a larger national conversation and national effort in this space. So for that piece of it, we have been focusing on professional development specifically as the way in which we could start to build a broader sort of national sense of momentum around this. But I hear the question that you're raising, and I think we're wrestling with it.
Can I ask another question, which is there a role here for teacher certification? In other words, I think of my own experience in education school where there was a lot of concern for my disposition, and I could show you my master's portfolio where I had to demonstrate a commitment to social justice and being an agent of change. Nobody ever thought to tell me what in retrospect seemed like an awfully important thing to have told me, which is you're a state actor, you're a public employee, you have enormous influence over a captive audience of other people's children. You have a key role in citizen formation. That was just no part of my education or my teacher training whatsoever. Shouldn't it be?
So that's a super interesting question. And I think, yes, there is a good conversation to be had there. And what you've just said, though, also means I think I should share that in addition to the K through 12 work I've just described, there's another whole body of work about civic education and higher education. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the PD, professional development work, would be a lot easier if colleges were doing a better job of providing this education as part of a BA in the first place. So I won't go through the elaborate organizational structure that's supporting the higher ed work, but just so that people have awareness, there is now a higher ed conversation that is aligned with the K through 12 EAD conversation. The American Political Science Association, for example, is reconsidering its guidance and suggestions for undergraduate political science education in relationship to EAD. Stanford has an incredible new model for civic education on campus where they have most of the freshman class now taking courses under a kind of educating for democracy rubric, and they're trying to get to a place where the whole campus will be doing that. So there's a lot actually happening in that space too. And so I think the kind of teacher certification question could be connected to that. There is a conversation as well in the higher ed space about there's a certain kind of, there's an elective credential that colleges and universities can get for civic engagement. I can't remember exactly what it's called. And just the way your certification was described, the way you get that is with a lot of service learning courses, things that are connected to the kinds of concepts you named, not connected to kind of basic democracy education. And so there's a conversation about revisiting that, the content of that elective credential, which would then help higher ed, again, have a sort of different footprint for how it's thinking about civic education.
My point simply is that if public education as an enterprise has a permission structure to demand anything of would-be teachers, it's this, right?
Yeah, and
This
I
is
think
why
it's a
we
really
built these
interesting,
schools.
really interesting point. And absolutely, I mean, I think that has not been a part of our conversations to date, but it does fit with this broader landscape of effort that I'm describing. So thanks for mooting it.
So about teachers being state actors reminded me of that students are also, situated relative to the state. We have frameworks for understanding their rights in schools, in free speech, in discipline cases and the like. I wonder what role, if any, there is for using those questions about the rights of students in school settings and the like as a vehicle for teaching broader civic lessons and engaging students in them.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a very rich area of current development. So we have in our curriculum, we have some of our case material that does come directly from some of the student rights works. What if can your backpack be searched, and how do you think about it? And exactly, yeah. So yes, I mean, I think that's been very productive, and at least in our efforts to really build out inquiry-based learning, support educators in that, and make sure we're engaging students. We do find that starting with those kinds of materials and then using them to lead toward the bigger picture is pretty effective, actually. So, yeah.
Other questions? Anyone online? I don't know if we've got anyone in the chat.
All right.
I believe we've reached almost at time. So maybe I'll give one suggestion. Actors, maybe public servants, maybe that's better way of thinking.
Because it implies
Well,
service,
well, I-
it has a lot of baggage, but yes.
So that has baggage too.
Yes.
So we can work on that. That's something.
Yes.
I like the concept.
So any sort of closing thoughts that both of you may have. Again, I want to sort of obviously thank you for doing this. Thank you for your leadership, Danielle, in this effort. I do think that besides creating not only a model for intergovernmental relations, you're also obviously creating an important framework and model for civics education and what it means to really ultimately be a citizen, and not simply an active citizen, but someone who has a love of country with warts and all. And I think it's such a critical antidote to the sort of broader kind of political zeitgeist that we're in. So I think this work has tremendous implications above and beyond the sort of, I don't want to say narrow scope, but specific scope that it's focused on. So thank you for that. And with that, maybe Robert, if you want to have a closing statement, and then Danielle, I'll give you the last word.
Nothing that I haven't said already. This is just essential work, and I wish you all the best of luck with it. And please don't interpret my skepticism as defeatism.
Don't worry.
We don't have the luxury of not being optimistic, and we don't have the luxury of not doing this work, even if the odds are long. And I say this as somebody who, again, is a school choice proponent, but still has an abiding affection and sees a role for traditional public education. This is essential work, regardless of under whose roof it occurs. The challenge is selling, and again, I hate to use the word selling, promoting, bully pulpiting, use whatever phrase you like, to convince America that this is essential work and must be done regardless of the educational setting.
Winning hearts and minds.
Hearts and minds.
I think. Yeah. So thank you very much, and for the conversation. This was terrific. I'm sure you could hear from my presentation that we are sort of really deep in the weeds, and therefore not as of yet as good at kind of external presentation and documentation of the work as we might be. So I really am grateful for the venue and the opportunity to start trying to make that shift, and then to think about what are the right ways of communicating to the policy landscape about the potential that's here and the way in which we can meaningfully change what we are offering to young people. So thank you. So super helpful.
Great. Thanks again.